Welcome in to episode 8 of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, as always, Owen Barnes, and we've got a lot to discuss today. We've got the first week of spring football, as well as an Alabama loss in basketball and some news that we need to discuss before we look ahead at this week's Arkansas game that's going to be happening on Saturday, the last regular season home game, last regular season game of the year. So let's get right in the show. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with a little bit of football. Earlier this week was the first spring practice. We heard from Kalen DeBoer, and then earlier today we heard from Kane Womack, the defensive coordinator that came over from South Alabama. They talked a little bit about different things that they're talking about, slowly doing installs, how the guys are really adjusting. Obviously, there's very little that you're going to know as to this point. Some of the bigger news that we heard is they are already practicing with the helmet comms that are new to football this year, as well as, they got the obligatory ask of who the starting quarterback is. And as for now, Jalen Milroe is taking snaps with the ones, surprise to nobody. The other big thing that seems to have bothered some people, and I quite frankly think some people are blowing it a little bit out of proportion, is that they're practicing with music. This was not something that you saw under the Saban era. You also are seeing reporters at practice. So if you look on Twitter or Facebook, I'm sure reporters are going to be putting out different articles. There's going to be pictures of practice. There's going to be a lot more media availability as it relates to Alabama football practices. That is not something you saw with Saban. Similarly, Saban famously, you couldn't talk to his assistant coaches or freshmen in year one. That is something that I'm sure Kalen DeBoer is going to be changing as well. So there are some new things that you have to see on the media front. So that's just something to keep an eye on. As spring practice continues to move forward and we get some additional information, I'll be sure to put together an article and talk more about it on the podcast. But just wanted to mention spring football is going on. While we're talking about football, the other thing I wanted to mention is partially a shout out and partially, just make people aware of it. Chris Lowe with ESPN, the guy who originally broke that Nick Saban was going to be retiring, put an article together and released it this morning on the 6th about the 49 hours that it took for Greg Byrne to officially hire Kalen DeBoer. It centered around, that apparently Byrne had been told by Saban last year at the end of 2022, hey, it's getting near. I don't know that this is my last year, but, if not, we're definitely nearing the latter stages, and, we'll readdress this as the year comes on. He also addresses that, many people thought that, or, were reported that names like Steve Sarkisian or Dabo Swinney or Lane Kiffin all were potentially interviewed. That was not the case. The article centered around Greg Byrne really had two major candidates, one being Mike Norvell, one being Kalen DeBoer. Kalen DeBoer ends up taking the job. Greg Byrne and his wife Regina had flown up to Seattle, had dinner with them, 49 hours after Saban retires. Greg Byrne had asked the team for 72 hours. They get it set up in 49. All is well. They get their guy. This is apparently something that, Greg Byrne had talked about having a plan in place because of Nick Saban's communication, as well as him just being a good AD. He had the plan in place. They executed the plan, and one of their top two guys is who they land. So, it really sounds like everything worked out. The big thing is that there's just some additional insight, as to why Saban retired. He talked about, 70 to 80% of the roster wanted to have conversations around playing time or money as it relates to NIL. So there's just different, tidbits, I think, of the article that if you're interested in Alabama athletics or Alabama football, you definitely need to check it out. It gives a lot of really, really good information. And if you're curious about like the inner workings of a college program, especially one at the highest level, then you really should give it a look. I'm going to link it in the show notes and in the description down below. So if you are curious in checking that out, just click the link in the description. So, now that we've got football covered, it's time to get into basketball. I have quite a lot of thoughts. Some of them are going to have been written in the Substack article that I put out following this game. I will link it in the show notes just so that, it's in there as well. If anybody's curious in reading the thoughts, they're going to be a little bit different than some of the thoughts I'm going to get put to words here, and then I'll write some others. At the end of the day, it looked like Alabama had maybe 10 or 15 minutes of good basketball in them against Florida. At the beginning of the game, I tweeted a few times that the effort was awesome. The defense seemed to be there. Shots weren't falling, but everything else was there. The rebounding was good, the effort was good, and everybody seemed to be clicking on all cylinders. It's reported right before the game that Latrell Wrightsell is going to play and is expected to be used, a decent bit, is kind of how Nate puts it. So he's the first person to check in. He gets in before the under 16 timeout. So it's like, oh, great. Latrell's in. We've got this guy back that we've been missing for the majority of the year. This is going to be awesome. Now Alabama just needs to put together some stops, put together some offense, hit some shots, and all will be good. Well, starting about the 10 to 8 minute under mark on the first half, you could start to tell that Alabama was a little late on a few rotations, not nearly to the level of the bad defense that we had seen in games past, but it definitely was starting to slack a little bit, and there had been some sloppy turnovers early in the game, and there had continued to be a few others. Grant Nelson seemed to be pushing it a little too much. I don't want to say trying too much, but definitely forcing everything too much. So it ends up getting to the point where you can definitely tell Alabama is kind of almost crossing the hill. Then just before the half, Florida goes on they hit a couple of shots. They end up getting a few dunks, get some steals and some runouts, and Alabama goes downhill, and it does not turn into the half you want. So you're curious when it comes out of half, how is Nate Oates going to do this? You can tell that the energy and effort was not what it was when it started the half, and they're starting to feel defeated. Early in the game, there was a lot of effort. There was diving on the floor. There's just a lot of people trying and, putting in the effort that you may not have seen the same level of in the Tennessee game. But they're definitely doing that in this game. Then they come out of the half, and Florida immediately keeps ripping it open, and it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And a few things became apparent. One, Alabama is exhausted. We mentioned it in the recap of the Tennessee game that Mark Sears and Aaron Estrada both seem to be feeling the fatigue that set in on Wrightsell being out. Over the course of the year, they had been used to playing somewhere in the 32 to 34 minute range, and now they're both playing in the 38 to 40 plus minute range, for example, in the overtime games, right? So, 40 Mark Sears plays 40 minutes against Ole Miss. They both play over 40 against Florida in game one. And all of these games they had without Wrightsell, so they're being asked to shoulder a much larger load, right? Because they didn't have that additional ball handler. Davin Cosby has stepped up, but he's still not, the ball handler at the same level that Wrightsell is, with the same level of experience. So we could start to see that in the Tennessee game. The Florida game, that happened and more, right? The legs on everyone felt tired. Grant Nelson was a step slow. Mark Sears, there were some shots that he ends up putting up in the, not mid-range, but a little bit further out that go off the front iron. His layups don't seem to have the same spin that they normally do. And quite frankly, we just were not hitting some pretty basic shots and could not buy a three to save our life. So, that's the big thing. These guys are exhausted. The other big thing is trying to figure out what Alabama can do when it comes to a very physical team. Part to do with these physical teams is that Alabama hasn't had Wrightsell, so they haven't had this person that can space the floor quite at the same level as someone else. Not to mention that Cosby and Walters and Stevenson are all freshmen that are not built to play in the physicality. Ep.8 typically seems to do really good in the physicality. This was not his best game. I talked about how good he did in the Tennessee game, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that Alabama has not been able to do as well on offense when some of these teams get more physical with it. The big thing that tells me is just the team needs to reset. they need to refocus, and they need to think about what it takes to win games. Because right now, I think there was a lot of forcing. There was a lot of letdown post that Tennessee game. The Tennessee game, we knew was going to cause a little bit of a letdown. You knew that there was going to be some players that maybe thought they were doing one thing and, oh, we're going to win the SEC title. You lose that game, and then you go on the road against Florida, and the energy just isn't there. You just had game day. You just had a huge home game. You had a huge crowd, and all of a sudden it's taken out of you because of the loss. So it didn't surprise me that Alabama lost the game. The nature in which they lost it was a little surprising, but to me, the big thing is Alabama is completely exhausted and just needs a break. If Alabama can get a break and reset and refocus going into this Arkansas and the SEC tournament, it will be huge. Also, Alabama playing on Tuesday, then playing Saturday, they've already secured the double bye. If they can get they played Tuesday, their next game will be Saturday. They won't play again until Friday. So Alabama has a long time to rest, and that's going to be really, really good for the team because, like I said and like I've mentioned, they were exhausted. So I don't want to take too much away from this Florida game. Florida, to their credit, did a good job. Alabama turned the ball over 13 times. It honestly felt like more than that. It, at times, was substantially worse than that. Grant Nelson did not have the game he had the first time. We talked about how good he was in the first game, had one of his best games of his career at Alabama. He ends up with 12 points, 6 rebounds, but 5 turnovers, and he fouls out. So, he did get some ticky-tack fouls. Grant Nelson has had the susceptibility to how he gets called. Sometimes will dictate how he defends and how he can play. So it would be curious for me to see, if Grant Nelson, takes it to people and, forces them to make some calls that maybe they're not, because Grant Nelson does seem to be getting a little bit more of the ticky-tack, smaller, hand-check style fouls that, big men typically are not getting. So, this game really felt like Alabama couldn't buy a shot. Only 2 people hit a 3 in the whole game. Rylan Griffin goes 1 of 3. Mark Sears goes 4 of 6. Mark Sears ends up having a really good game. He has 33 points, but he has just 1 rebound and 2 turnovers. So by no means was Mark the reason you lost this game. Honestly, Mark's the reason you didn't lose it by 40. But, it still just didn't feel like Mark was playing at his peak. I think a lot of that had to do with being tired, so I don't take anything about off Mark on that one. Estrada had a really good game. He was able to do a little bit more down low. I think how Florida defends suits his style better. He goes 9 of 11 in game 1. Game 2, he goes 8 of 11. So I think that Aaron Estrada, how he plays against Florida and their style of defense, fits how he likes to play on offense. So for me, the big things are, Alabama tied Florida in rebounding. They did get more offensive rebounds than the number 3 offensive rebounding team in the country. But Alabama just missed shots. They went 21% from 3. They, like I said, they turned the ball over, and they just were not. They were a step slow on screens. Everything just seemed lethargic. So the big thing that we want to talk about in this game is just, at the end of the day, the team is in a spot that you did not think they would be. Coming into the season, expectations among reasonable fans were somewhere between 10-8 and 13-5. That is exactly where you're sitting as a fully reasonable likelihood. You're currently sitting at 12-5. You're 21-10, you're 20-10. You have a good chance against Arkansas, we'll talk about it in a second, to get to 21-10, 13-5 in the conference. 13-5 and 20-10, most people would have accepted coming into the season. You're going to be a top 5 seed in the NCAA tournament. and you're not worried about the bubble. You're not worried about, being on the 8-9 line, having to play a 1 in round 2. You're completely happy with where you're at. So I think that's the big thing. The big thing is the season is not a failure. The season has done exactly what you would have hoped. They had 3 assistants leave. They had an entire roster leave. You only had 3 guys back. And Alabama has exceeded expectations by the majority of fans. One of the guys, however, that was back and is back, we want to talk a little bit more about, is Rylan Griffin. Rylan Griffin had an injury that happened in this game, and I'm going to try to be sure to include information in the next piece of content that I put out, whether it be on Twitter, on Substack, or on YouTube. But I'm going to be sure to include what happened with the injury. So he does get injured in the Florida game. He can't put any weight on his leg. Some people were thinking the worst. What happened was it was a calf injury. They're taking an MRI. We should know more information soon, so I will include as soon as I find out what happened and how long he potentially will be out. So that's something we need to watch, especially with the limited front or backcourt depth that we have with Latrell. He only played 8 minutes in this game, so whether he's having on a minutes restriction, whether he just wasn't able to play, whatever the case, this is something we want to keep an eye on, because Latrell and Rylan both being out greatly diminishes your backcourt. If you can get them back, the backcourt goes up, the fatigue goes down, and the quality of play goes up with it. So those are the 2 big ones that I wanted to talk about. And then let's get into the Arkansas game. So I have some stats here in front of me for the Arkansas game. Arkansas is a team that is not really elite at anything except getting to the free throw line. Arkansas is 3rd in the country at free throw attempts compared to field goal attempts. They do a really good job of getting to the line and making shots. It is a huge piece of their offense. With Alabama's susceptibility to foul, this is something that you're going to want to keep an eye on. Alabama did a good job in the Florida game of getting Florida in foul trouble. However, they weren't able to capitalize on it. Arkansas is going to try to put Alabama in foul trouble. They're going to try to weaken our interior so that they can open up driving lanes by taking out Grant Nelson, taking out Wiggy, taking out Pringle. That's going to be at the top of their game plan. Alabama's going to have to defend the ball and not let it get inside to be able to cause those issues. That's what Alabama's going to have to do in this game. If Alabama can limit the ball and can play its style, they will be able to keep Arkansas off the line. And if Alabama can play its style and play its offense at home in Coleman, they had a bad game last game. They're going to want to rebound. If Alabama can do what they can do in Coleman Coliseum, the fouls won't be an issue, right? In the Mississippi State game, Tolu Smith shoots a ton of fouls. It doesn't cost us anything at all in Coleman. In the A&M game, they end up shooting a decent number of fouls. It did not cost us. LSU, the exact same way. In these games, Alabama actually gave up a decent number of foul shots. It did not cost them anything because of how well Alabama's offense played and the defense was serviceable. As long as Alabama can do that, the foul trouble should not be an issue. And even if it does happen, it's not going to cost you the game. However, if Alabama lets it become a close game and is lethargic on offense, is a step slow on defense, Arkansas will get to the foul line, foul out the front line, and then try to keep pounding the rock on the interior. We know that Alabama does not have the front court depth to handle that. Thankfully, Arkansas is led by their guards, so this is not something where you're expecting a big man to really dominate the game. They do have Mekhi Mitchell
that's back from last year's team. He's really good on the interior, and he is, can be a force on the interior. In this last game, he has 19 points, 8 rebounds, 3 blocks in 30 minutes. So he is somebody that can play a lot of minutes in the interior and affect shots in the interior. However, Arkansas does not typically play through their interior. They play through their guards in Mark and Battle and Ellis and Devo Davis. In the last game, Davenport also played 28 minutes. So this is a team that Arkansas, they play their minutes and they're big guys, right? They play Mekhi Mitchell mostly and Trevon Brazile. Brazile has 6 points this last game. Mitchell has 19. Battle has 29. Ellis has 16, right? You get fairly even scoring. Trayvon Mark just misses double digits with 9. All the starters scored more than 6 points, and this is in that last game that they just played tonight against LSU. They end up winning that game by 11. So this is an Arkansas team that has now won a game and going to be looking to do what they can do to beat Alabama, because Arkansas has not had the season they would have hoped. They're sitting at 6-11 in conference, and everything is going downhill. We often will talk about how Nate Oates has done a better job than Arkansas and Musselman. Arkansas fans are quick to say, but Musselman has back-to-back Elite Eights. That's a true statement. But Arkansas has not shown anything in the regular season to be able to award what's happening in the postseason. Because this season, they're going to have to win the SEC tournament to even make the postseason, right? It shows an instability in the program to have Arkansas be so topsy-turvy. They obviously have the ability to win big games as a program. They just don't show it in the regular season, right? So this is something that we saw a few Arkansas fans actually admitting after they lost to Vandy in Kentucky. Like, hey, this is, Musselman not doing anything in the regular season is becoming an issue. So at the end of the day, for Alabama, this is just a cannot lose. This will be a quad 3 loss. This will be a terrible loss. This will honestly probably diminish some of the spirits of the guys on the team. This is a game that you just cannot lose. It'll be senior night. I'm sure there will be quite a few guys that will be giving out or that will go through ceremonies. I'm not sure who all is going to do it. If I hear who all is going to be going through the senior night duties, I will put it out in the thread or on Twitter. The assumption is Aaron Estrada. We know he's the only one that's out of eligibility. Other guys could be Nick Pringle, Grant Nelson, Mark Sears, Latrell Reitzel. Some combination of these guys will be going through senior night. The only one that we have a pretty good expectation is Aaron Estrada because he is out of eligibility. I also will be posting anything I hear in regards to Latrell Reitzel and him coming back from the injury. He only played 8 minutes in in his first game back against Florida. So I will let everybody know what I hear in regards to that, as well as the Rylan Griffin. Is it a calf sprain? Is it a bruise? What's going on with Rylan Griffin? Will he be available for next game? So stay in touch with all of my content. If this is something that you're interested in, if you want to know more about Alabama basketball or Alabama football, please stay in touch. If you do have any questions, comments, concerns, please put them down on the bottom or shoot me a message on Twitter or on Substack. If you have anything else you would like to see or hear from me, please let me know. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Peace.